Look at your cat right now, if there's one nearby, and think about something strange about it. It is not really tame. Not the way a dog is tame, or a cow, or a horse. It is, underneath the fur and the food bowl and the little bed you bought it, a wild animal that made a decision, on its own, that your house was a good place to live, and the proof of that decision is written directly into its DNA. When scientists finally sat down and compared that DNA against every wildcat species on the planet, almost none of them matched. Only one did. And the population that matched turned out to be so narrow, so specific, that researchers could point to a stretch of land on a map, no bigger than a few countries, and say, this is where it happened. It only happened once. Everything else is just the aftermath spreading out over 10,000 years. The story doesn't start in a laboratory. It starts on a small island in the Mediterranean, on a spring morning in 2004, on the southern coast of Cyprus. A team of archaeologists was carefully working through the layers of soil at a site called Chilorokambos, brushing away dirt one thin layer at a time when they uncovered something that stopped the entire dig cold. Buried in the earth was a human skeleton. 18 inches away, in its own separate, deliberately dug pit, was the skeleton of a cat. The two graves had been dug at the same time, by the same hands. The bodies had been positioned facing each other, close enough that whoever buried them clearly meant for the two to be found together, or at least to rest together. This was not a case of a stray animal wandering into an open grave and dying there by accident. Animals don't get their own separate pit, carefully placed, facing a human body. This was a burial, a choice. Someone, 9,500 years ago, thought a cat deserved to be buried the way a person is buried. When the radiocarbon dating came back, it confirmed the site was around 9,500 years old, and that number sent a real wave of concern through the small community of scientists who study how wild animals became domestic ones. Here's why that number mattered so much. Cyprus is an island. It has no native wildcat population, and it never has. There's no land bridge, no shallow crossing, nothing that would let a wildcat walk there on its own. The only way a cat could have ended up on that island nearly 10,000 years ago is if a human being physically carried it there, on a boat, across open water, on purpose, as something worth the risk and effort of bringing along. Think about what that actually implies. Whoever made that boat trip wasn't just tolerating a cat that happened to be nearby. They valued it enough to load it onto a small wooden vessel, cross open sea with it, and eventually bury it like family. Which means the bond between humans and cats was already old by that point, already emotional, already worth the risk of a sea voyage, thousands of years before anyone had written a word, built a pyramid, or founded a single one of the civilizations most people think of when they picture the ancient world. That discovery cracked open a question nobody had a clean answer for. If cats were already this close to humans 9,500 years ago, where had they actually come from? Which wild species was the ancestor? Which population, in which specific corner of the planet, made the shift from fleeing humans to staying close to them? Every wildcat species on Earth suddenly became a suspect, and for a while, nobody could say with confidence which one was guilty. To understand how big a puzzle this actually is, it helps to know the scale of what came out of it. There are roughly 600 million domestic cats alive on the planet right now. They live on every continent except Antarctica, in apartment buildings, on farms, in back alleys, fed from small cans or feeding themselves in the streets of cities that never asked for them. They come in hundreds of coat patterns and dozens of recognized breeds, from the flat-faced Persian to the hairless Sphinx to the enormous Maine Coon. And every single one of them, every cat alive anywhere on Earth today, traces back to wild ancestors from one specific corner of the Middle East. Not several regions, not a handful of independent domestication events the way some other animals show. One place, one population, one narrow window of time. On the surface, the question of where domestic cats came from sounds like it should be easy. Cats are cats. They look like small wildcats, so pick almost any wildcat species, and the resemblance seems obvious at a glance. But when scientists actually ran the DNA comparison, testing samples from domestic cats around the world against tissue from every wildcat species they could get their hands on, the answer turned out to be nowhere near that simple. Most wildcats did not match. Species that looked like logical candidates on site turned out, once the genetics came back, to be distant. Relatives, at best. Related the way humans are related to gorillas, not the way parents are related to children. The comparison eliminated species after species before it finally landed on the one population that produced a clean, unambiguous result. Here's how that elimination actually worked, because the process itself is where the myths start falling apart. The wildcat family contains around 37 living species. The big cats, lions, tigers, leopards, jaguars, snow leopards, are the famous ones, the animals people picture the moment they hear the word cat. But they represent only a small slice of the total diversity. The majority of wildcat species are small to medium-sized animals most people outside their home regions have never even heard of. The fishing cat of Southeast Asian wetlands, the flat-headed cat of Borneo, the pampas cat of South America, the caracal of Africa and the Middle East, the ocelot, the serval, the Scottish wildcat, the jungle cat. Dozens of species spread across every continent except Antarctica and Australia. Researchers tested domestic cat DNA against this entire range, and the eliminations started almost immediately. The big cats were ruled out first. The genetic distance between a house cat, curled up on a couch, and a lion is enormous, so large it points to nothing closer than a very ancient common ancestor, millions of years back. Not a domestication event within the last 10,000 years. The South American wildcats, the ocelots, margays, and pampas cats, were eliminated next. They formed their own distinct branch of the cat family tree, one that split off from the house cat's lineage long before humans existed in anything resembling their modern form. Some of the eliminations were genuinely surprising, and one in particular unsettled researchers who thought they already had the answer figured out. The jungle cat, a medium-sized species found across South and Southeast Asia, had long been floated as a possible ancestor, partly because of its historical presence at ancient Egyptian sites. When the genetic data came back, the jungle cat turned out to be too distant. It was not the source. Ancient DNA extracted from cat remains at Egyptian archaeological sites confirmed the point with brutal clarity. The cats living alongside the Egyptians were not jungle cats. They were Near Eastern wildcats. The jungle cat had been present in Egypt, and Egyptians almost certainly did tame individual jungle cats from time to time as curiosities or working animals. But the house cat as a species did not descend from them. One tempting candidate removed from the suspect list. The Scottish wildcat presented its own tangled complication. Technically, it's the same species as the eventual answer, Felis sylvestris, but a separate, isolated subspecies. And today, it's one of the most endangered mammals in Europe, with only a small number of genetically pure individuals believed to survive in the Scottish Highlands. Genetic testing showed the Scottish wildcat was distinct enough from both the Near Eastern population and the modern house cat that it couldn't be the domestication source. It had been geographically and genetically isolated for too long. And to make the picture even messier, researchers found that many surviving Scottish wildcats actually carry substantial domestic cat DNA, the legacy of generations of interbreeding with farm and feral cats. It's a strange reversal of the usual direction of influence. Instead of the wild population shaping the tame population has been quietly reshaping the wild one, and it's now one of the biggest headaches for conservationists trying to protect what little pure wildcat population is left. What the comparison was really hunting for wasn't a loose resemblance or a general family relationship. It needed a wild population whose DNA matched domestic cats so closely that the two could credibly be read as ancestor and direct descendant. That kind of match requires an extremely recent split. An ancestor that would have been walking the same landscape as early humans, whose descendants ended up living in human houses within a relatively short evolutionary window. The match, when it finally appeared, was the Near Eastern wildcat, Felis sylvestris libica, a small, sandy-colored cat that still lives today across North Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and the Middle East. When researchers compared genomes from Near Eastern wildcats across the region, stretching from what is now Turkey through Syria and Iraq into the Iranian plateau, the genetic signature of domestic cats worldwide lined up, almost perfectly with that specific population. Not the African wildcat further south in sub-Saharan Africa, though it's a close relative. Not the European wildcat of Scotland and the Pyrenees, separated from the domestic lineage for too long to match. Not the Chinese mountain cat, which some scientists had floated as a possible secondary ancestor for Asian house cats. One population, one region. That region happened to be exactly where humans were reinventing how they lived. Around 10,000 years ago, in that same stretch of the Fertile Crescent, people were cultivating wheat and barley, domesticating sheep and goats and cattle, and building the first permanent villages the world had ever seen. For the first time in human history, people were storing large quantities of grain in one place for extended stretches of time. And here's the plain mechanism behind everything that follows. Grain stores attract mice. Mice attract wild cats. A village of 200 people storing grain might attract several hundred mice, a concentration of prey that simply doesn't exist anywhere in the natural world. The Near Eastern wildcat is, by nature, a skilled and patient hunter, and the cats that stumbled onto this new kind of hunting ground had found something their species had never encountered before. There was no reason to walk away from it. This is where the story runs directly into a popular myth worth pausing on, because it's probably the one thing most people assume without ever questioning it. That humans domesticated cats. Deliberately. On purpose, the way we tamed wolves into dogs, researchers reconstructing this history were careful to point out that the actual process bore almost no resemblance to that kind of traditional domestication. Traditional domestication involves people deliberately selecting individual animals for specific traits and breeding them on purpose, generation after generation, to reshape them. Dogs were bred from wolves through a long process in which humans chose the most useful, most cooperative individuals to breed forward. Horses, cattle, pigs, and sheep all went through centuries of deliberate human-driven selection that physically and behaviorally reshaped them. None of that happened with cats. Nobody chose which wild cats would breed. Nobody was selecting for temperament the way a shepherd selects for wool or a farmer selects for docility. What actually happened was quieter and, frankly, stranger. Humans noticed the benefit and passively encouraged it, rather than engineering it. A cat that killed the rats and mice threatening a family's grain store was a cat worth tolerating, maybe worth leaving a little food out for. People started doing exactly that. Cats moved closer. Nobody made a top-down decision to domesticate cats the way early herders made a decision to start, breeding wolves into working dogs. It happened gradually, and it was driven far more by the cat's own choices than by human intervention. Of all the major domesticated animals on Earth, the cat may be the only one that essentially domesticated itself. If a detail like that, an entire species quietly writing its own domestication story instead of waiting for humans to write it for them, is the kind of thread that keeps you watching. There's a lot more of exactly that hidden in the rest of the genetic record. So stay with this one, because the next part gets even more precise. The DNA preserved a startlingly exact record of this founding event, and it's worth slowing down here, because the specificity is genuinely rare in genetics. When researchers analyzed mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down almost unchanged from mother to offspring, generation after generation. They found that all domestic cats currently alive worldwide descended from a strikingly small group of founding females. Somewhere around 5 individual wild cats living in the Fertile Crescent region roughly 10,000 years ago, whose descendants spread across the entire planet over the following 10 millennia. 5 maternal lineages. 600 million cats sitting on the other end of that line today. Sit with that math for a second, because it's almost impossible to hold comfortably. Every cat that has ever purred on a human lap. Every cat that has ever knocked a glass off a table just to watch it fall. Every cat that has ever been photographed squeezed into a cardboard box far too small for it. All of them trace their maternal line back to one of 5 wild female cats that lived near early farming settlements in the Middle East 10,000 years ago. That 5 lineage signature is detectable in cat populations everywhere on the planet today. Cats in Japan, cats in Brazil, cats in Nigeria, cats in Norway, all carry genomes tracing back to those 5 Near Eastern founders. The signal has been blurred somewhat by thousands of years of cats interbreeding with each other as populations mixed, moved, and occasionally crossed paths with surviving local wildcats. In parts of Europe, some domestic cats carry a small trace of European wildcat DNA from occasional mating between feral domestic cats and their wild cousins. In parts of Africa, some domestic cats carry a trace of African wildcat ancestry. But in every documented case, these are minor genetic contributions, layered on top of a genome that remains fundamentally and overwhelmingly Near Eastern in origin. One of the most striking findings from the genetic comparison is that this founding event happened only once. Every domestic cat on Earth today, no matter where it currently lives, carries the genetic fingerprint of that single domestication event in the Fertile Crescent. If cats had truly been domesticated a second time somewhere else on the planet, independently the way some other animals were, that population would carry a distinct genetic baseline of its own. And no such second baseline has ever turned up anywhere in the modern domestic cat population, despite years of researchers actively looking for exactly that kind of evidence. The spread out of that founding population happened in at least 2 distinct waves, and understanding both waves is how the map of modern cats starts to make sense. The first wave was slow. Cats gradually moved alongside human agricultural communities as farming itself spread westward into Europe and eastward into Asia over the course of several thousand years. A slow, patient drift, village by village, following the grain. The second wave moved much faster, and it was driven by ships. Sailors discovered early on that cats were extraordinarily useful cargo, keeping rodent populations under control and ship holds packed with grain, rope, and food supplies for long voyages. Cats went home. Essentially everywhere ships went. By the time of the Roman Empire, domestic cats had already reached Britain. By the medieval period, they were established in Scandinavia. Within a few centuries of the first major oceanic voyages of exploration, cats had reached the Americas, sub-Saharan Africa, and Australia, none of which had ever had a domestic cat population before humans brought one across the water. Ancient Egypt occupies a very specific role in this story. And the DNA evidence has clarified exactly what that role was, and just as importantly, what it was not. Egypt did not domesticate the cat. The genetic timeline makes that clear. By the time Egyptian civilization was taking shape, cats had already been living alongside farming communities in the Fertile Crescent for thousands of years. What Egypt did was amplify an existing relationship into something the ancient world had never seen before. Egyptians elevated cats to a cultural and religious status with no real parallel anywhere else in antiquity. Cats were associated with the goddess Bastet, and killing one, even by accident, could be treated as a serious crime. Millions of cats were mummified as religious offerings, and archaeologists have excavated entire cat cemeteries in Egypt, containing hundreds of thousands of preserved animals. That cultural elevation had a real genetic consequence. Egyptian cats were traded, gifted, and transported widely across the ancient Mediterranean world as valuable sacred animals. When researchers compared ancient cat DNA recovered from archaeological sites across Europe and North Africa, they identified a distinct Egyptian genetic signature spreading westward through the ancient world, starting around 1500 BCE, a second, faster wave of dispersal layered directly on top of the earlier, slower agricultural spread. The global cat population alive today carries the genetic imprint of both waves at once. It also turned up something unexpected in cats recovered from Viking sites in northern Europe. Evidence that seafaring populations were carrying cats with Egyptian genetic markers as far as the Baltic more than 1,000 years ago, well before anyone assumed that lineage traveled that far north at all. Now zoom out much further than 10,000 years because the cat family's real history goes back a lot deeper than the story of grain stores and boats, and this deeper timeline is part of what makes the whole domestication story so unusual. The broader Felidae family, every cat species alive, today, wild or domestic, shares a common ancestor that lived somewhere around 10 to 12 million years ago, likely in Asia. From that ancestor, cats radiated outward across the planet in a series of migrations, splitting into the major lineages we recognize now. The big cats like lions and tigers, the ocelot lineage of the Americas, the Asian leopard cat lineage, and eventually, much closer to the present, the small wildcat lineage that includes the Near Eastern wildcat itself. That lineage split off from its closest relatives only around 1 million years ago, recent by evolutionary standards, but still 990,000 years before a single human ever left food out for a cat. What this means is that the wild ancestor of every house cat had already been a fully formed, fully wild predator for the better part of 1 million years before agriculture ever existed. Domestication didn't create the cat. It borrowed a species that evolution had already finished building and nudged it just slightly toward tolerating people. That deep evolutionary backstory matters for understanding the human stakes of this story too, because the relationship between cats and grain wasn't just a pleasant coincidence. It may have genuinely mattered for human survival. Rodents don't just eat stored grain. They contaminate it, and historically, they've carried disease. Some of the deadliest epidemics in human history, including plague outbreaks that swept through cities for centuries, spread largely through rodent populations and the fleas that lived on them. A cat population controlling rodent numbers around a village's food supply wasn't just protecting calories. It may have been quietly reducing the disease risk that came bundled with dense human settlements and their overflowing grain stores. Nobody in the Fertile Crescent 10,000 years ago understood any of that in scientific terms, of course. They just noticed that places with cats around had fewer rats, and fewer rats seemed to mean fewer problems. That simple, practical observation, repeated across generations and thousands of villages, is very plausibly one of the quiet threads holding early agricultural civilization together. Here's a twist in the story that even researchers who'd been tracking this for years found surprising when it turned up in the data. And it's the kind of detail that complicates the tidy narrative just enough to make it feel real. Not every trait that spread through the domestic cat population came from that original Near Eastern founding group. Consider polydactyly, the condition where a cat is born with extra toes, sometimes 6 or 7 on a single paw instead of the usual 5. It's a genetic mutation, not a domestication trait, and it shows up in cat populations with wildly uneven frequency depending on geography. In parts of the northeastern United States and the Canadian Maritimes, polydactyl cats are unusually common, likely because a handful of ship's cats carrying the mutation arrived centuries ago and it spread locally through isolated breeding populations. An accident of history. Riding along on top of the much older domestication story, completely unrelated to the original Near Eastern genome. It's a reminder that not everything interesting about a house cat's genetics goes back to that founding moment 10,000 years ago. Some of it is far more recent, far more random, and owes more to a single ship's cargo hold than to any ancient farming village. One of the most vivid pieces of supporting evidence for the whole story came not from a genetics lab, but from that original dig site in Cyprus. Later, genetic testing on the cat, buried at Chalurocambos in 2004, confirmed just how significant the find really was. The cat was tested and found to be a Near Eastern wildcat, entirely consistent with the fertile crescent origin the genome studies would later pin down. It wasn't yet a fully domestic cat in the modern genetic sense. The specific genetic markers associated with full domestication hadn't yet accumulated to the degree seen in cats today. But it was undeniably a cat that had been living closely enough with people that someone chose to carry it across open water and bury it beside a human body with obvious care. What those domestication-linked genetic changes actually look like turned out to be one of the more surprising results to come out of the whole comparison. The house cat genome is strikingly similar to its Near Eastern wildcat ancestor. Most of the domestic cat's DNA is essentially unchanged from the wild original. The physical differences between a modern house cat and a Near Eastern wildcat are genuinely minor. Some variation in coat color, slight differences in size, subtle shifts in skull shape. Nothing remotely close to the dramatic physical transformation separating a Great Dane from a wolf, or a domestic pig from a wild boar. The genetic changes that did accumulate in cats were concentrated in a few specific areas. Genes tied to fear response and aggression show clear modification, meaning the domestic cat is measurably less reactive to unfamiliar stimuli than its wild ancestor, and more inclined to approach rather than immediately flee. Genes tied to the brain's reward system also changed, and domestic cats show stronger neurological responses to social reward, meaning interaction with humans actually triggers positive signals in a house cat's brain in a way it would not in a wild one. Genes related to memory shifted as well, in ways that may help domestic cats form and retain associations between specific human behaviors and specific outcomes, like the sound of a can opener predicting food. Think of it like this. The physical blueprint of the cat barely changed at all in 10,000 years. Only a handful of settings inside that blueprint, the ones governing fear and reward and memory, got quietly turned up or down, just enough to make coexistence work. The comparison also turned up something that surprised researchers about modern cat breeds specifically. 10,000 years of living alongside humans, plus roughly a century of formal intensive breed development, still hasn't moved the cat genome very far from where it started. The visible breed differences in coat color, body shape, and head structure sit on top of a genome that, underneath all of that, is essentially the same animal that walked cautiously into a Neolithic grain store 10,000 years ago. That's very likely why cats retain so much of their wild behavior even after millennia indoors. A cat that has spent 10 straight years living in a house will still stalk and pounce on anything that moves, still mark and defend territory, still communicate largely through the same signals a wild cat uses in the scrubland, and would still be fully capable of surviving independently if it suddenly had to. Feral cat populations have established themselves wherever domestic cats have been released or have escaped, from the Australian outback to the Galapagos Islands to the Scottish Highlands, and these cats do not need to relearn how to be wild, because the wildness was never actually removed in the first place. It was simply managed and softened for as long as a human relationship made that worthwhile. The global feral cat situation illustrates this with almost unsettling clarity, and it's part of the real-world consequence of everything this DNA record describes. When domestic cats escape into the wild, or are abandoned there, they do not struggle to adapt. They hunt immediately. They establish territories within weeks. They breed at a rapid pace. Within a generation or two, feral cats behave in ways essentially indistinguishable from true wild cats. Australian native animals evolved for millions of years without any native feline predator at all, and feral cats have since devastated populations of native birds, reptiles, and small mammals, in some cases pushing species to the brink of extinction. The cats did not become an ecological crisis because they transformed into something new and dangerous. It's closer to the opposite. The cat changed almost not at all, because essentially no one was ever doing the selecting. The cats that ended up living in human homes selected themselves, choosing the environment that suited them best, and carrying nearly their entire wild genome into it, fully intact. So here's what all of this evidence actually supports, and just as importantly, what it doesn't. The DNA record makes a strong, well-supported case that domestic cats worldwide descend from a small founding population of Near Eastern wildcats in the Fertile Crescent roughly 10,000 years ago, and that this appears to have happened only once, spreading out through two overlapping waves, one slow and agricultural, one fast and maritime. What it does not support is anything about individual personality, ancestry-based temperament or destiny, coat color, breed, or the population. A cat's ancestors came from tells you nothing reliable about how affectionate, intelligent, or wild any specific cat will turn out to be. Genetics explains where the species came from. It doesn't explain why your particular cat insists on sitting directly on your keyboard the moment you sit down to work. That part is still just a cat being a cat, and no amount of genome sequencing is going to change that. There's something genuinely worth sitting with in the conclusion of all this research. Scientists went into the comparison expecting to eventually find a clear ancestor, and they did find one. But the precision of the answer wasn't something anyone had fully anticipated going in. Not simply the Near Eastern wildcat as a broad regional category, but one specific population. From one specific geography at one specific moment in time, the DNA functioned almost like a timestamp buried inside every living cat. It recorded not just which animal was the ancestor, but roughly when the relationship began, how many individuals founded the entire modern population, and how their descendants fanned out from that single point across the following 10,000 years. That's an extraordinary amount of history encoded quietly in the genome of every ordinary tabby, asleep on every ordinary couch on Earth right now. Which brings this back to where it started. Look at your cat again. If there's one nearby, curled up somewhere it definitely wasn't invited to be. What you're actually looking at is a wild animal, almost unchanged at the genetic level, that quietly decided, on its own terms, 10,000 years ago that living near humans was a better deal than living without them, and it has never fully let go of the wild animal it still is underneath. One wild cat species, one narrow region, one moment in history when grain stores, rodent swarms, and one particular small sandy-colored predator all ended up in the same place at the same time. If a story like that, a species that wrote its own origin story instead of waiting for us to write it for them, is the kind of thing you want more of, there's a lot more of it buried quietly in DNA, waiting to be dug up. Subscribe, and we'll keep digging.